I caught my future daughter-in-law pouring industrial-grade superglue over the exact spot where my disabled wife was supposed to sit. And the worst part was my own son was standing right beside her, keeping watch and laughing. I did not yell. I did not cause a scene. I handled it the way a man who spent 40 years in commercial construction handles a structural flaw. I quietly fixed it. Hours later, when the wedding master of ceremonies asked the radiant bride to stand up for her first dance, the violent tearing of $18,000 worth of designer lace echoed through the silent ballroom, leaving her completely paralyzed. But to understand how my son's perfect wedding turned into a nightmare of his own making, you need to know what happened 2 hours before the ceremony started. I am Victor Langdon. I am 70 years old, and I spent my entire life building a commercial contracting company from the ground up. I know the smell of drywall, the weight of steel, and the exact cost of loyalty. It was a Saturday morning exactly 2 hours before the guests were scheduled to arrive at the most exclusive luxury wedding venue in the city. I was there early because I had just paid $15,000 out of my own pocket to upgrade the ballroom lighting. Derek, my son, had casually mentioned that the standard lights would ruin their wedding photos. Like the fool I was, I wrote the check. I wanted everything to be perfect for him. The grand ballroom was completely empty, bathed in the dim, quiet shadows that exist just before a massive event kicks off. The caterers were out in the loading dock, and the florists had already finished their elaborate centerpieces. I walked softly across the thick carpets, just an old man, admiring the expensive setup he had bankrolled. But as I approached the raised platform, where the sweetheart table and the immediate family seating were arranged, I heard a sound. It was a low, muffled giggle. I stopped dead in my tracks, letting the darkness of the stage wing hide me. Standing right at the edge of the family table were my son Derek and his bride-to-be Natalie. Natalie was not in her wedding dress yet. She was wearing a silk robe with the word bride embroidered on the back, but she was not holding makeup or a mirror. She was holding a heavy industrial squeeze bottle. She was leaning over the plush velvet cushioned chair that was explicitly marked with a gold name tag. Catherine, my wife, Derek's mother. Catherine had suffered a mild stroke 8 months ago. She survived, thank God, but her mobility was compromised. She walked with a cane, moved slowly, and had to wear protective adult undergarments because she occasionally lost control of her bladder when she was stressed or strained. It was a humiliating reality for a proud woman, and we kept it a strict family secret. Natalie knew this. Derek knew this. I watched my blood turning to ice as Natalie squeezed a thick, clear gel directly onto the center of Catherine's velvet cushion. She smeared it around, making sure it seeped deep into the fabric fibers. Derek was standing right next to her, glancing over his shoulder toward the main doors. He nudged her arm with his elbow. "Make sure you get the edges," I heard him whisper. "If she shifts around, I want to make sure it holds." Natalie giggled again, a high-pitched, malicious sound. "Do not worry," she replied. "Once she sits on this for a few hours, she is not getting up without leaving half her dignity behind." For a fraction of a second, the father in me wanted to believe I was misunderstanding the situation. I wanted to believe my only child was not standing there plotting to publicly humiliate the woman who gave birth to him. I stepped out of the shadows. My heavy footsteps echoed against the polished marble floor. "What exactly is going on here?" I asked. My voice was completely flat, devoid of any emotion. Natalie jumped so hard she nearly dropped the bottle. She quickly shoved it behind her back, her eyes wide with sudden panic. Derek spun around. The color drained from his face for a brief moment, but then, with a chilling smoothness I had never seen before, he composed himself. He actually smiled. He stepped right in front of Natalie, blocking my view of her hands. "Dad," he said, letting out an easy, relaxed sigh. "You scared us. We were just fixing a little problem here." I walked up the steps to the platform, stopping 2 feet away from them. I did not look at Natalie. I looked directly into my son's eyes. "Fixing what problem, Derek?" I asked, The cushion on Mom's chair. Derek lied, his voice practically dripping with fake concern. The velvet threading on the seat was coming loose. Natalie noticed it earlier, and she was just using some clear fabric tape to secure it down. You know how Mom struggles to get up and down these days. We were just worried she might trip or slide off the chair if the fabric gave way. We are just looking out for her dad. We want her to be safe today. It was the perfect lie. It sounded caring. It sounded protective. If I were just some clueless old man who spent his life behind a desk, I might have thanked them and walked away with a warm heart. But I was not a man who sat behind a desk. I had spent 40 years on active construction sites, and as I stood there inhaling the air around the table, a very specific, sharp, toxic chemical odor hit the back of my throat. It was not fabric tape. It was not standard craft glue. It was industrial-grade heat-curing polyurethane adhesive. We used it on construction sites to bond heavy materials that were never meant to come apart. When exposed to the heat of a human body, that chemical cures and hardens like concrete. It permanently fuses any porous material it touches. The pieces fell into place with sickening clarity. If Catherine sat on that chair in the $5,000 silk gown I had bought her for this occasion, the dress would literally weld itself to the velvet. They wanted her to sit through the 2-hour dinner. They wanted the glue to cure. And when the music started and she tried to stand up, the chair would come with her. The silk dress would tear entirely off the back of her body. She would fall forward, exposing her protective undergarments to 300 high society guests, investors, and family members. It was not a prank. It was a calculated psychological assassination. And my son was helping. I looked at the dark stains soaking into the velvet. Then I looked back at Derek. He was holding his breath, waiting to see if I bought his story. The urge to grab him by the collar and throw him out of the building was overwhelming. But a deeper, colder instinct took over. If I exploded now, they would just deny it. They would say it was an accident, a misunderstanding, and I would be the crazy old man ruining the wedding. I needed to know why they were doing this. I needed to let them think they were the smartest people in the room. I forced my facial muscles to relax. I let out a heavy, tired sigh, playing the exact role of the naive, exhausted father they thought I was. I appreciate that, son, I said, my voice gentle. Your mother has been so nervous about today. Knowing you two are looking out for her means a lot to me. Derek visibly relaxed. His shoulders dropped and the arrogant smirk returned to the corners of his mouth. Of course, Dad. We love her. We just want today to be perfect. It will be, I replied, turning my back to them. I am going to go check on the lighting crew. You two go get ready. I walked away, feeling their eyes on my back. I could almost hear them celebrating their narrow escape. They thought they had won. They thought the trap was set and waiting for my vulnerable wife. But as I stepped back into the shadows of the hallway, the father who loved his son died, and the contractor who built an empire took over. I was not going to throw that chair away. I was going to give them exactly the wedding they deserved. The heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom swung shut behind me, muting the ambient noise of the venue preparations. But the silence in the hallway offered no comfort. My heart was hammering against my ribs with a slow, heavy rhythm that I felt all the way up in my jaw. I walked down the long carpeted corridor, my posture perfectly straight, my steps measured and calm. Anyone looking at me would have seen a proud father taking a quiet stroll before his only son's wedding. But beneath the surface, my entire reality had just been fractured. The scent of that thick, clear gel was still burning inside my nostrils. It is funny how memory works. You can forget a name, a date, or a conversation, but a scent locks itself into your brain forever. I did not need to see the label on the bottle Natalie was holding to know exactly what was inside it. The sharp, acrid, mistakably chemical odor that had hung in the air around the sweetheart table was something I had breathed in for decades on commercial construction sites. It was industrial-grade polyurethane adhesive, It is not something you buy in a craft aisle. It is a heavy-duty compound used by contractors to fuse concrete bind steel framing and permanently lock porous materials together. And my son had just looked me dead in the eye and called it fabric tape. I stopped near a large decorative window at the end of the hall, staring out at the manicured lawns of the venue, though I was not really seeing the flowers or the fountains. I was replaying Derek's face in my mind. The absolute ease with which he had lied to me was terrifying. There was no stutter. There was no hesitation. He had stepped in front of his bride, blocking my view, and effortlessly spun a narrative of love and concern. We were just worried she might trip or slide off the chair. We want her to be safe today. He had used his own mother's physical disability, her recent stroke, her fragility as a shield to cover up a malicious, calculated attack. Catherine had spent the last 8 months fighting through grueling physical therapy sessions just to be able to walk down the aisle on my arm today. She had cried in our bedroom because she was so terrified of looking weak in front of his new in-laws. Derek knew all of this. He knew about her fears. He knew about her adult protective garments. He knew every single vulnerability she had. And instead of protecting her, he had weaponized those vulnerabilities for a prank so cruel it defied human logic. He had sold me a plausible lie wrapped in fake filial piety, expecting my paternal blind spot to do the rest of the work. But Derek made one fatal miscalculation. He forgot who raised him. He forgot where the money that paid for his elite education, his luxury cars, and this $300,000 wedding actually came from. It did not come from a corporate boardroom. It came from dust, sweat, and raw materials. For 40 years, I ran my commercial contracting company from the dirt up. I know exactly how polyurethane adhesive behaves. When that gel soaks into a porous surface, like the velvet cushioning of a banquet chair, it does not just sit on top. It permeates the fibers. It sinks deep into the threading, and it stays dormant until it is activated by pressure and heat. The moment a human body sits on it, the natural warmth of the skin accelerates the curing process. Within 30 minutes, it becomes incredibly tacky. Within an hour, it hardens. By the time the 2-hour dinner service was over, that adhesive would have turned the velvet cushion and whatever fabric was touching it into a single fused, immovable block of solid matter. It was a chemical trap, perfectly designed, perfectly executed, and waiting patiently for the victim to sit down. My hands balled into tight fists inside my jacket pockets. I could feel my fingernails digging into my palms. The sheer malice required to plan something like this was staggering. They had brought that bottle from outside. They had planned this well in advance. I stood there by the window, forcing myself to visualize exactly what would have happened if I had not decided to come early to check on the lighting rig. I imagined Catherine looking beautiful and fragile in the custom $5,000 silk gown I had purchased for her, lowering herself onto that chair. She would have smiled through the pain in her joints. She would have eaten her dinner completely unaware of the chemical reaction happening beneath her. She would have clapped for the speeches. And then the master of ceremonies would have called for the family dances. Catherine would have grabbed her cane. She would have pushed down on the armrests, using all her limited upper body strength to stand up. But her body would not move. The silk of her dress would be cemented to the chair. Panicking, feeling the eyes of 300 guests on her, she would have pushed harder. The delicate silk would have offered zero resistance against the cured polyurethane. It would have ripped violently, shredding away from her body, leaving the back of her dress completely destroyed and firmly attached to the seat. She would have fallen forward, exposed, humiliated, and stripped of her dignity in front of the city's elite. And Derek and Natalie would have been sitting right next to her, probably holding their phones, recording her degradation under the guise of trying to help her up. The thought of my wife crying on the floor of a ballroom, while her son recorded her humiliation, made a cold, dark resolve settle over my mind. The shock was completely gone now. The grief of realizing my son was a monster had evaporated, replaced by a crystalline mechanical focus. I am a builder. When I find a rotten beam in a house, I do not cry over it. I cut it out, and I replace it. My son had just proven that he was structurally compromised. He was rotten to his very core. I glanced at my watch. It was still early. The bridal party was scheduled to move to the outdoor gardens for their pre-wedding photographs in exactly 10 minutes. The ballroom would be entirely deserted again. I stepped away from the window and quietly opened the door to a small utility closet near the service elevators. I stepped inside, pulling the door shut, until only a tiny crack remained, allowing me to see the main hallway. I stood in the dark, breathing slowly, waiting for the perpetrators to leave the scene of their crime. 10 minutes later, I heard the loud, obnoxious laughter of Natalie echoing down the hall. I watched through the crack as she and Derek walked past, holding hands, heading out to the gardens to smile for the cameras. They looked so happy. They looked so proud of themselves. I waited until their voices completely faded away into the distance. Then I pushed the utility door open. I smoothed down the lapels of my suit jacket. I walked back toward the heavy oak doors of the grand ballroom. It was time to conduct a little structural test of my own. I needed to know exactly how fast that adhesive was curing. The shredded linen hung from my trembling fingers. I stared at the ruined fabric, my mind racing to comprehend the sheer magnitude of their cruelty. Derek and Natalie had planned this with meticulous precision. They had selected this specific velvet chair, knowing full well what would happen when my wife sat down. Catherine had spent the last 6 months fighting her way back from the stroke. She endured hours of painful physical therapy just to be able to walk into this ballroom tonight. She was terrified of being seen in her vulnerable state, but she trusted our family completely. I had bought her a beautiful custom silk gown, hoping to make her feel like the queen she truly was today and every day moving forward. My own son and his wife wanted to turn her into a public spectacle. They wanted the fabric to fuse with the seat. They wanted her dress to rip away when she stood up for the toast. They wanted 300 high society guests to see the protective undergarments she was forced to wear. The disgust churning in my stomach solidified into a cold, calculated rage. I refused to simply throw the chair away or cancel the event. I was going to give them exactly what they ordered, but with a twist they would never anticipate. I pulled out my phone and called Marcus, my trusted estate manager. He answered on the very first ring, sensing the quiet urgency in my strained voice right away. Marcus arrived at this ballroom through the service doors within 5 minutes. I showed him the torn napkin and pointed to the velvet chair reserved for Catherine. His jaw clenched as he realized the malicious trap that had been set. I gave him clear instructions on what needed to happen before the event officially began. We moved swiftly and silently, lifting the treated chair from the head table with extreme caution. We swapped it with the matching chair designated for Natalie, ensuring the placement looked entirely undisturbed. Then I ordered Marcus to retrieve another identical chair from the storage room and apply the exact same industrial adhesive to the seat where Derek would soon sit. The trap was now reset for the true villains instead. With the seating arrangement secretly altered, I returned to the main hallway to greet my wife. Catherine looked absolutely radiant in her flowing silk gown, though her hands trembled slightly as she held onto her cane. I kissed her cheek, whispering words of encouragement to soothe her frayed nerves. Derek and Natalie emerged from their private photo shoot, plastering wide, fake smiles across their faces. They rushed over to compliment Catherine, their voices dripping with an artificial sweetness that made my blood boil. I watched them carefully, noting the sly glances they exchanged when they thought I was not paying attention. They believed their cruel plan was securely in motion, completely unaware of their impending catastrophic downfall that would soon unfold before the entire crowd tonight. The ballroom doors finally opened, welcoming the elite members of our high society circle. The room filled with the sound of clinking champagne glasses and polite chatter. I guided Catherine to the head table, pulling out her chair with gentle care. She sat down gracefully, the silk of her gown settling smoothly against the pristine velvet upholstery. Derek and Natalie took their seats moments later, grinning broadly as they settled into their designated spots. I watched from the corner of my eye as they shifted their weight, pressing themselves firmly against the hidden adhesive. Dinner was served flawlessly, the culinary delights, distracting the guests from the heavy tension, building silently at the very front of the massive room where we sat together eating our meal. As the final plates were cleared away, the time for the traditional evening toasts swiftly approached. Derek leaned over to me, his eyes gleaming with a sickening anticipation. He whispered that he and Natalie were going to stand up first to honor Catherine publicly. I nodded slowly, maintaining a perfectly neutral expression as I gave him my blessing. The master of ceremonies tapped a spoon against his crystal glass, instantly commanding the room to fall into a hushed silence. Derek and Natalie grabbed their microphones, flashing their brilliant smiles toward the crowd. They planted their feet firmly on the ground and attempted to rise gracefully from their velvet chairs to address the gathered audience of our peers, waiting eagerly in the grand, beautiful ballroom space. They did not rise gracefully. Instead, a sickening sound of tearing fabric echoed loudly through the dead quiet ballroom. Derek gasped loudly as his custom-tailored trousers ripped apart, exposing his bare skin and brightly colored underwear to the shocked guests. Natalie shrieked in absolute horror as the expensive fabric of her designer dress shredded violently, leaving her utterly exposed and humiliated before her wealthy friends. They stumbled awkwardly, desperately grabbing at the remaining scraps of their ruined clothing, while the chairs remained firmly stuck to their bodies for several painful seconds. Gasps of disbelief erupted from the crowd, followed closely by scattered murmurs and stifled laughter. I sat calmly beside my wife, watching the magnificent justice unfold exactly as I had secretly, meticulously planned. Derek flushed a deep crimson, his eyes darting wildly around the room as he struggled to comprehend the spectacular failure of his malicious scheme. Natalie burst into dramatic tears, attempting to hide behind the floral centerpiece while furiously glaring at the catering staff nearby. Catherine looked at me with wide, confused eyes, completely oblivious to the fact that this humiliating fate had originally been intended for her vulnerable self. I gently squeezed her hand, offering her a reassuring smile before standing up from my own perfectly normal velvet chair. The room quieted down as I took the microphone from his two trembling hands. It was finally time to expose the ugly truth lurking beneath their pathetic, cruel, hollow, and shallow, empty social facade right now. Ladies and gentlemen, I began, my voice echoing clearly across the expansive ballroom. We are gathered here to celebrate her remarkable recovery. I paused, letting the silence stretch uncomfortably, while Derek and Natalie cowered in their shredded garments. However, I continued, some individuals decided to use this joyous occasion to plot a deeply disturbing prank meant to humiliate my beloved wife. Murmurs of outrage rippled through the audience as realization dawned on their affluent faces. They coated a chair with industrial adhesive, hoping to mock her medical struggles for their own sick amusement. Derek shook his head frantically, whispering pathetic denials that no one in the crowd believed. Fortunately, I discovered their vile trap earlier today and simply rearranged the seating order accordingly for tonight. The collective gasp from the guests was incredibly satisfying to hear in person. I turned my attention back to my son, my expression hardening into cold steel. You thought you could destroy her dignity, but you only exposed your own moral bankruptcy. I reached into my tailored suit pocket and pulled out a folded stack of legal documents. This is not just about a cruel, childish prank, I announced firmly. I have spent the last few hours reviewing the company financial records. Derek turned pale, his humiliation suddenly eclipsed by absolute terror. I know about the offshore accounts and the forged signatures, I stated clearly. You are officially cut off, disinherited, and the authorities are waiting for you outside the lobby right now this evening. I walked back into the grand ballroom, closing the heavy oak doors quietly behind me. The vast space was beautifully decorated with thousands of white roses and crystal centerpieces. It was a scene of perfect elegance paid for by the sweat of my brow. Yet as I approached the raised platform where the head table sat, all I could see was the ugliness hiding in plain sight. I stopped in front of the two velvet chairs. They were identical in every physical way. They shared the same carved mahogany legs, the same curved backrests, and the same plush velvet cushions. The only distinguishing feature was the small gold-plated name tag resting on the table in front of each seat. One tag read Catherine, the other read Natalie. I reached into my tailored suit pants and pulled out the heavy-duty folding knife I carried every day. A man who spends his life on construction sites never travels without a good blade. I crouched beside my wife's designated chair, feeling the 4 steel bolts holding the velvet cushion firmly in place. They were standard hexagonal screws, nothing a seasoned contractor could not handle with leverage and brute force. I snapped the blade open, lodging the thick steel flathead edge into the first bolt. I applied steady pressure, twisting my wrist until the metal gave way with a soft click. Within 2 minutes, I completely unfastened the velvet cushion soaked in the invisible curing polyurethane adhesive. I lifted the toxic cushion away from the wooden frame, careful not to let my hands touch the affected fabric. I set it gently on the carpeted floor. I then moved over to the identical chair designated for my future daughter-in-law. I knelt down and repeated the exact same process, unscrewing the 4 bolts holding Natalie's pristine cushion in place. I lifted her clean cushion and carried it over to Catherine's chair frame. I aligned the screw holes, perfectly sliding the bolts back into place and tightening them down with the edge of my knife until the seat was absolutely secure. My wife would now sit on a perfectly safe cushion. She would eat her meal in comfort, protected from the malicious trap my son helped lay for her. I picked up the adhesive-soaked cushion, carried it to the bride's chair frame, and fastened it down securely. Natalie's seat was now the trap. She would be sitting on the exact chemical snare she eagerly prepared for a recovering woman. I stood up, closed my knife, and slipped it into my pocket. The chairs looked completely untouched. No one would ever suspect a thing. But as I stared at the swapped cushions, a cold, unsettling thought began to gnaw at the back of my mind. The immediate danger to my wife was neutralized, but the underlying threat remained entirely unresolved. I crossed my arms, looking at the empty ballroom. Normal people do not commit acts of extreme, calculated cruelty just for a cheap laugh. There is always a deeper, darker motive driving this kind of sociopathic behavior. Derek was arrogant, yes, but he was also incredibly protective of his public image. He would never risk causing a massive, humiliating scene at his own highly publicized, expensive wedding, unless there was a significant payoff waiting for him at the end of the night. So, why did they want to humiliate Catherine so badly? Why did they want to expose her medical vulnerabilities to 300 of the most influential people in the city? What could they possibly gain from parading her weakness in front of our investors, our friends, and our colleagues? The realization hit me like a physical blow to the chest. They needed an audience. They needed witnesses. They wanted everyone in our social and professional circle to see my wife fail, to see her lose control, to view her as an incompetent, broken woman. This was absolutely not a prank. This was a carefully orchestrated stage play, and they needed documentation to make their narrative stick. If they were plotting something that massive, I needed concrete evidence. I needed to capture their true intentions on record. I turned on my heel and walked briskly out of the ballroom, navigating the maze of back hallways until I reached the service exit. I pushed the heavy metal door open and stepped out directly into the bright, warm afternoon sunlight. I walked swiftly across the asphalt parking lot toward my heavy-duty pickup truck. I unlocked the door, climbed inside, and opened the locked center console. Inside, resting next to my measuring tapes and blueprints, was a rugged voice-activated job site dictaphone. It was a heavy, durable piece of equipment I used to record verbal contracts, supply orders, and architectural disputes on loud construction sites. It had a highly sensitive microphone designed to pick up voices over the sound of heavy machinery and a battery life that could easily last for 48 straight hours. I grabbed the dictaphone, along with a fresh roll of heavy-duty black masking tape from my crowded glove compartment. I locked my truck and walked quickly back into the venue, slipping through the service doors unnoticed by the catering staff who were busy unloading crates of champagne. I returned to the grand ballroom and walked straight up to the sweetheart table. The table was draped in thick, cascading white linen that reached all the way down to the floor, providing the perfect cover. I crawled under the table, finding myself in a small, dark, enclosed space right beneath where Derek and Natalie would sit for the entire evening. I switched the dictaphone on, verifying that the small red recording light was blinking steadily. I ripped off 3 very long strips of the black masking tape. I pressed the dictaphone firmly against the wooden underside of the table, taping it down securely so it would not fall or vibrate during the dinner service. The microphone was positioned perfectly, just inches away from where their laps would be. It would cleanly pick up every single whisper, every malicious giggle, and every dirty secret they shared while they anxiously waited for the adhesive to cure. I crawled out from under the table, brushing the invisible dust from the knees of my tailored trousers. I stood alone in the center of the magnificent room, silently staring at the hidden trap I had just finalized. The physical danger was handled, and the audio surveillance was active. Yet my sharp paternal intuition, honed over 70 long years of surviving. Both cutthroat business and fatherhood screamed that I was still missing a crucial piece of the complex puzzle. An audio recording would capture their immediate reactions and vile conversations during the reception, but it would not reveal the foundational blueprint of their entire scheme. I needed to know exactly how they planned to leverage Catherine's public humiliation. I needed to see their absolute end game. People who scheme together inevitably leave a digital trail of their toxic ambitions behind them. They text, they email, they document their greed. I looked up toward the grand staircase leading to the private bridal suites on the 2nd floor. Derek and Natalie were currently outside taking lengthy professional photographs in the venue's manicured gardens, foolishly leaving their valuable personal belongings completely unguarded and unattended in their respective dressing rooms. My son was confident, entitled, and devastatingly careless. It was time to exploit that carelessness, to uncover the complete truth. I left the grand ballroom behind me and walked toward the sweeping marble staircase located at the far end of the lavish venue foyer. The catering staff was very busy rushing quickly through the kitchen doors. None of them paid attention to the elderly man in the tailored suit making his way up to the 2nd floor. The upper level was dedicated to the private bridal suites. I walked down the carpeted hallway, passing closed doors, until I found the one marked with a small brass plaque that read, "Groom." I pushed the heavy wooden door open and stepped inside. The room was exactly what I expected from my son. It smelled heavily of expensive designer cologne and spilled dark liquor. Empty crystal tumblers were scattered across the mahogany coffee table, surrounded by discarded garment bags. It was a scene of arrogant celebration. I stood quietly and closed the door firmly behind me, ensuring the lock clicked into place. My eyes scanned the messy room, moving past the leather sofas until they landed on a sleek glass desk near the window. Resting right in the center of the desk, completely unattended, was Derek's silver tablet device. I walked over to the desk and stared down at the screen. My heart was beating with a steady, rhythmic thud. I reached out and tapped the glass surface. The screen flared to life, displaying a smiling photograph of Derek and Natalie. Below their faces was a numerical keypad, demanding a 4-digit security code. Derek never changed his passwords unless forced to. I typed in his birth year. The screen shook, rejecting the attempt. I typed in Natalie's birth year. Another rejection. I paused, letting out a quiet breath. I typed in the year my wife was born. The screen unlocked instantly. A bitter wave of irony washed over me as the home screen populated. He had used his mother's birth year to secure the device he was currently using to plot her destruction. He took everything from us, even our personal milestones, and repurposed them for his own selfish convenience. I did not have time to dwell on the emotional pain. I had a job to do. I bypassed his banking folders and tapped directly on the messaging icon, bringing up his private digital conversations. Natalie's name was pinned to the top of his list. I tapped on her name, opening a massive thread of daily communication. I did not scroll through their wedding planning details. Instead, I tapped the search bar and typed in Catherine. The screen buffered before highlighting dozens of messages. I scrolled back to a conversation dated 3 weeks ago, right around the time the seating chart was finalized. I began to read their private words, and the remaining paternal affection I held for my son bled out of my chest. They did not talk about my wife like she was a human being. They talked about her like she was a heavy burden. Natalie complained endlessly about how Catherine's wheelchair would ruin the aesthetic of the wedding photographs. Derek agreed, whining about spending money on accessible transportation. As I scrolled closer to the current date, the tone shifted from petty annoyance to calculated predatory malice. I found a cluster of messages sent 2 days ago. Natalie had sent a link to an industrial supply website showing the heavy-duty polyurethane adhesive. Beneath the link, she wrote a single sentence: "I bought it. It arrives tomorrow." My thumb hovered as I read Derek's response. He did not tell her to stop. He replied, "Perfect. Make sure you pack it so the old man does not see it." I braced myself against the desk. I scrolled down to the messages they exchanged late last night. The glowing words made my blood run ice cold. Natalie had initiated the conversation. "I am so nervous about tomorrow," she wrote. "What if she realizes the cushion is wet before she sits down?" Derek responded immediately. "She will not notice anything. Her legs are so numb from the nerve damage she can barely feel where she sits anyway." I stared at that sentence, feeling a physical ache. My son was weaponizing his mother's medical trauma. The next set of messages revealed a darkness I could never have anticipated. Natalie wrote back, "Okay, but you have to promise me you will have your phone ready to record. Once she stands up and the dress rips, make sure you get the whole meltdown on video. Seeing her soil herself in front of the mayor and your dad's investors is exactly what we need to prove our point." I read the words again. What point were they trying to prove? I pulled up Derek's lengthy response. "I know," he wrote. "Combine that video with her stroke medical records, and my lawyer says we have a slam-dunk case for a conservatorship." I stopped breathing. The air in the suite suddenly felt incredibly thin. A conservatorship. They were planning a legal coup. I forced my eyes to focus on the screen. "We force him to hand over the trust to me now," Derek had typed. "I cannot wait 20 years for him to die. Once Mom is declared a ward of the state, we can move her into a facility and take over the estate. This is our only way to get the money without waiting for nature to take its course." I set the tablet down on the glass desk, pulling my hands away from it, as if the cold metal burned my skin. The sheer magnitude of their calculated betrayal was absolutely incomprehensible to me. They were actively trying to manufacture a highly public medical crisis just to strip us of our fundamental legal rights. They wanted to humiliate my beloved Catherine so profoundly that I would be left completely emotionally destroyed, leaving them a completely clear and unopposed path to seize total control of the massive financial empire I had spent 4 long, grueling decades building from nothing. I stood completely alone in the quiet room, listening closely to the muffled, distant sounds of the wedding preparations continuing downstairs. He viewed my poor wife's devastating illness not as a family tragedy, but as a highly convenient legal loophole to exploit. Every single smile, every warm hug, and every fake expression of gratitude he had ever given me had been a carefully calculated lie. It was all simply designed to keep me perfectly complacent, while he secretly sharpened the long knife he planned to bury deeply in my back. I looked at the glowing screen one last time, making absolutely sure I memorized every single one of his brutal, unforgiving words. I did not cry. I did not shout. Men who survive the ruthless world of commercial contracting do not waste energy on useless emotional outbursts. We assess the damage, reinforce our positions, and demolish the compromised structures without mercy. Derek thought he was playing a brilliant game of chess against a weak, clueless old man. He thought he had factored in every single variable to secure his inheritance today. But he completely forgot that I owned the board, I owned the pieces, and I wrote the rules. I picked up the tablet once again, my hands completely steady now, and navigated quickly away from the messages into his primary email application. I needed to see exactly how deep this financial rot truly went before I burned his entire deceitful world straight to the ground. The bright white screen of the email application illuminated the dim bridal suite, casting long shadows against the walls. My finger hovered over the digital keyboard. The text messages I had just read were still burning behind my eyes, searing themselves into my memory. I needed to see the logistical framework of their betrayal. A legal coup of this magnitude does not happen overnight. It requires planning, documentation, and the complicit guidance of an attorney who is willing to operate in the gray areas of the law. I tapped the search bar at the top of the screen and typed the word conservatorship. The system buffered for a fraction of a second before a long list of email threads populated the screen. The sheer number of results made my stomach turn. This was not a passing thought or a sudden temptation. This was a dedicated long-term project. I opened the most recent email dated just 3 days ago. It was sent to a private attorney I did not recognize, a man operating out of a boutique firm downtown. The subject line read, "Final medical strategy and venue preparation." I took a slow, steady breath and began to read the clinical, detached words my son had used to describe the woman who had nurtured him, protected him, and loved him unconditionally for his entire life. Derek had constructed a completely fabricated narrative regarding the recovery of Catherine from her stroke. He wrote paragraph after paragraph describing her as hopelessly confused, physically deteriorating, and entirely incapable of managing her own basic human needs. He deliberately twisted her moments of fatigue into episodes of severe cognitive decline. He painted me as a stubborn, grieving husband who was in deep denial about the mental state of his wife, claiming I was becoming increasingly erratic and emotionally unstable. The email included an attached file containing the most private medical records of Catherine. Derek had somehow managed to siphon her charts, her physical therapy evaluations, and her prescription lists without our knowledge. He was building a comprehensive dossier designed to strip us of our basic human rights. I scrolled down to the response from the attorney. The lawyer advised Derek that while the medical records were helpful, judges in our state often hesitated to grant full conservatorship without a documented public incident that proved the parents were a danger to themselves or a disruption to society. The lawyer specifically requested concrete, undeniable visual evidence of the supposed incompetence of Catherine and my inability to handle her condition. My son had replied with a chilling promise. He told the attorney to prepare the final petition and have it ready to file on Monday morning. He guaranteed that the required public incident would occur this weekend. He wrote that the entire city would bear witness to our downfall. I scrolled further down the email chain, my vision blurring slightly at the sheer malice radiating from the screen. Derek had forwarded the attorney a series of attached image files. I tapped the first image and the screen expanded to show a screenshot of a text message conversation between him and Natalie. It was the exact exchange they had shared late last night, captured and archived as strategic evidence for their lawyer. Seeing the words, isolated in this legal context, made them infinitely more devastating. Natalie wrote, "Once she stands up and the dress rips, make sure you record the meltdown. Seeing her soil herself in front of the mayor and the investors of your father is exactly what we need." I stared at her words, processing the vile, predatory calculation behind them. She did not just want to embarrass her mother-in-law. She wanted to create a spectacle so degrading that it would shatter the spirit of Catherine permanently. And then I read the reply from Derek, preserved perfectly in the screenshot. "I know. Combine that video with her stroke medical records, and my lawyer says we have a slam-dunk case for a conservatorship. We declare Mom mentally and physically incompetent. Dad will be so broken by the public humiliation he will not fight it. We force him to hand over the Langdon Trust to me. I cannot wait 20 years for him to die. I read that last sentence over and over again, until the letters lost their meaning and became nothing more than dark shapes on a glowing background. I cannot wait 20 years for him to die. That was the absolute core of the issue. It was never about concern for the health of Catherine. It was never about managing a family crisis. It was solely about the Langdon Trust. I had established that trust 15 years ago, pouring every ounce of my hard-earned wealth into a secure financial vehicle designed to protect my family for generations. It was meant to provide for the medical care of Catherine, to secure the future for Derek, and to fund the charitable causes we held dear. Derek was the sole heir, but the trust was structured so that he would not gain full, unrestricted access to the principal capital until he turned 50, or until both Catherine and I passed away. He did not want to wait for his inheritance. He wanted the keys to the kingdom today, and he was perfectly willing to destroy his own parents to get them. The depth of this betrayal was an abyss with no bottom. He was not just stealing money. I was attempting to legally erase our autonomy. A conservatorship would mean we could not make our own medical decisions. We could not control our own bank accounts. We could not even choose where we lived. Derek would have the absolute power to sell our home, dismiss the trusted doctors of Catherine, and place us in whichever facility he deemed appropriate. I would hold ultimate authority over our lives, ruling us with the exact cruelty he and Natalie displayed right now. I placed the tablet back onto the desk, ensuring it rested exactly where I found it. The cold focus that guided me in this ballroom returned, sweeping away all traces of paternal heartbreak. I stood on the edge of a battlefield, and the enemy wore my last name. They built a weapon to execute a flawless legal coup, utilizing the tragedy of my wife as primary ammunition. But every complex scheme requires funding, especially when retaining downtown law firms and hosting a $300,000 wedding. Their ambition required massive hidden cash. They could not finance this operation using their own personal income. I needed to know exactly how Derek was paying for all of this. Natalie had spent the last 6 months loudly bragging to anyone who would listen that her wealthy family was generously covering the exorbitant costs of this lavish reception. I reached out and tapped the screen once more, closing the horrifying email thread with the estate lawyer. I navigated back to the main inbox folder, my eyes narrowing with intense concentration. I took a deep, calming and stabilizing breath to prepare myself. The undeniable truth awaited me. Right there on the screen. I tapped the search bar again, but this time I did not type anything about a conservatorship. I typed in the names of the wedding vendors, the florists, the caterers, and the venue management. I was going to follow the money trail, and I was going to expose his financial crimes without any mercy whatsoever. The search results populated, instantly filling the screen with dozens of high-priority email threads. I started with the floral design company that provided the thousands of delicate white roses currently decorating the ballroom downstairs. Natalie had spent the last 6 months loudly bragging at every social event we attended about how her supposedly wealthy parents were footing the entire bill for this $300,000 extravaganza. I tapped on the very first email, opening a detailed digital invoice for $55,000. I bypassed the itemized list of arrangements and scrolled directly down to the billing information. My eyes locked on the payment routing details, and the sickening reality of the situation hit me with the force of a physical blow. The invoice was not billed to the parents of Natalie. It was not billed to any personal account associated with her family. The payment was billed directly to Langdon Commercial Contracting, my company. I closed the floral invoice and immediately opened the billing thread for the luxury catering service. The total cost for the gourmet dinner and the open bar was $84,000. I scrolled down to the bottom of the page. Once again, the invoice was billed directly to my commercial construction company. I opened the receipts for the venue rental, the live jazz band, and the custom wedding cake. Every single massive expense associated with this lavish wedding was being systematically drained straight out of my corporate operational accounts. I sat down heavily in the leather chair, positioned behind the glass desk, feeling a cold, unfamiliar numbness spreading through my chest. Derek was the vice president of regional operations for my company. I had given him that title because I believed he was finally ready to take on the responsibility of managing our large-scale commercial developments. I granted him high-level clearance to authorize material purchases and manage the budgets for our active construction sites. He had taken that profound professional trust and used it to orchestrate a massive, coordinated theft. I needed to see exactly how he was hiding these exorbitant luxury expenses from my accounting department. I navigated away from his personal inbox and logged directly into his corporate email application, pulling up his approved project budgets for the current fiscal quarter. The sheer audacity of his scheme was absolutely breathtaking. Derek had officially registered a completely fabricated commercial project in our corporate system. He had created a fraudulent portfolio for a massive industrial warehouse development supposedly located on the far west side of the city. He was systematically routing all of the luxury wedding expenses through this fake project by intentionally mislabeling the vendor invoices as routine construction costs. The $55,000 floral arrangement bill was officially coded in our ledger as heavy-duty soil stabilization and commercial landscaping. The $84,000 catering bill was fraudulently expensed as long-term rentals for specialized excavation machinery. He had even managed to expense the $18,000 custom silk and lace wedding gown Natalie was currently wearing by classifying it as high-grade industrial steel scaffolding. He was mocking me. He was mocking the company I had spent 4 decades bleeding for. The truth about the family of Natalie was now glaringly obvious. They were not wealthy socialites from old money. They were completely broke. They were pathetic frauds who wanted to project an image of extreme wealth without having a single dollar to their name. Derek was so desperate to impress this manipulative woman and her pretentious parents that he was willing to commit massive corporate fraud to buy their approval. He was stealing hundreds of thousands of dollars from my business to finance a fake lifestyle for a woman who was actively plotting to destroy the life of his own mother. He was literally paying for the very event where they planned to publicly humiliate my disabled wife. This was no longer just a heartbreaking story about a deeply ungrateful son taking advantage of his wealthy father. This was not a simple family dispute over a spoiled child borrowing money without permission. This was a severe, calculated, and highly organized financial crime. Derek was committing felony embezzlement on a massive corporate scale. By routing these fake invoices through my business, he was artificially inflating our operational expenses, which directly impacted our corporate tax filings. He was putting my entire contracting empire at extreme risk of federal tax evasion charges, severe financial penalties, and potentially devastating government audits. He was actively jeopardizing the livelihoods of the 300 hardworking men and women who relied on my company to feed their own families every single week. I thought about the loyal foremen, the dedicated bricklayers, and the exhausted project managers who spent 12 hours a day to ensure our building projects were completed on time. They worked tirelessly to build a solid reputation for Langdon commercial contracting. Derek was sitting in an air-conditioned office casually signing away their hard-earned profits to pay for imported champagne and out-of-season white roses. The level of disrespect he showed toward the very foundation of our family wealth was utterly unforgivable. I stared at the glowing screen of the tablet, watching the digital evidence of his felony crimes staring back at me. Any lingering trace of paternal hesitation, any small, desperate hope that my son could somehow be saved or redeemed, completely evaporated into the cold air of the bridal suite. When you build structures for a living, you learn very quickly that you cannot compromise with a cracked foundation. You cannot negotiate with rot. If you try to patch over a fundamental structural failure, the entire building will eventually collapse. Derek was a catastrophic structural failure. He was a liability that threatened to destroy everything I had built and everyone I loved. The gloves were completely off now. I was no longer operating as a grieving, disappointed father trying to understand where he went wrong. I was operating as the ruthless chief executive officer of a multi-million-dollar corporation, and I had just discovered a rat chewing through the main power lines of my business. I closed the corporate email application and locked the silver tablet, making absolutely sure I placed it exactly where I found it. I did not need to take the device with me. The fraudulent invoices, the fabricated project budgets, and the highly incriminating communications with the estate lawyer were all permanently backed up on the secure corporate servers. I already possessed all the evidence I would ever need to completely dismantle his entire life. I stood up from the leather chair, smoothing down the front of my tailored suit jacket with perfectly steady hands. The time for quiet observation had officially ended. It was time to begin the demolition phase of this project. I turned away from the desk and walked slowly toward the heavy wooden door of the bridal suite. The muffled sounds of the jazz band playing in the grand ballroom drifted faintly through the floorboards. The oblivious guests were currently enjoying the expensive cocktails and the lavish appetizers that my stolen money had purchased for them. They were celebrating the union of two people who represented the absolute worst of human nature. I placed my hand on the brass doorknob, feeling a profound sense of clarity wash over my mind. I knew exactly what my next move had to be. I needed to assemble my demolition team immediately. I closed the heavy wooden door of the bridal suite behind me, ensuring the latch clicked softly into place. The plush carpet of the hallway absorbed the sound of my footsteps as I walked away from the room that held the digital evidence of my son's ultimate betrayal. I did not take the grand sweeping marble staircase back down to the main foyer, where the oblivious guests were gathering. Instead, I bypassed the ornate elevators and pushed open a heavy fire door leading to the venue's emergency stairwell. The air inside was completely different from the opulent corridors. It was cool, stale, and completely silent, smelling faintly of concrete and industrial floor cleaner. It reminded me perfectly of an unfinished job site. I descended half a flight of stairs and stopped on the concrete landing, completely isolated from the joyful celebration echoing through the rest of the building. I reached into the interior breast pocket of my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my cellular phone. I did not need to scroll through my contact list. I dialed the direct private cell phone number of my corporate attorney from memory. Thomas was not just a lawyer. He was a highly aggressive, deeply strategic legal shark who had spent the last 20 years protecting my commercial contracting empire from predatory competitors and fraudulent subcontractors. I was exactly the kind of man you wanted in your corner when it was time to tear a compromised structure down to its bare studs. The line rang exactly twice before he answered. Thomas never took weekends completely off. His sharp, gravelly voice came through the speaker, carrying the familiar tone of a man who was always prepared for a corporate crisis. He greeted me, asking if there was a problem with the venue contracts I had signed for the wedding. I leaned my back against the cold concrete wall of the stairwell and stared down at the empty steps below me. I told him that the venue was perfectly fine, but we had a catastrophic internal breach within the company that required his immediate ruthless intervention. I heard the distinct sound of a chair rolling backward on hardwood as Thomas gave me his undivided attention. I did not waste time dancing around the painful reality of the situation. I spoke with the precise, detached tone of a chief executive officer delivering a terminal damage report. I told him that my son, his regional vice president of operations, had actively conspired to commit a massive corporate fraud. I explained how Derek had secretly manufactured a completely fabricated industrial warehouse project in our corporate accounting system to systematically embezzle hundreds of thousands of dollars. I explained that the money was being illegally siphoned to pay for the lavish luxury wedding currently taking place just on the other side of the fire door. Thomas remained entirely silent for several seconds, absorbing the sheer magnitude of the legal liability Derek had recklessly exposed my company to. When he finally spoke, his voice possessed a cold, metallic edge that confirmed he was already switching into absolute demolition mode. He asked me exactly what I wanted to do. I gave him his marching orders with crystal-clear precision. I instructed Thomas to immediately contact our primary corporate banking representatives. I ordered him to freeze every single joint operational account that Derek had any level of authorized access to. I told him to completely sever my son's digital footprint from the company servers and permanently revoke his administrative privileges. I wanted all of his high-limit corporate credit cards canceled immediately, rendering them absolutely useless pieces of plastic by the time the evening was over. But that was only the beginning of the financial execution. I took a slow, deep breath, pulling the stale air of the stairwell into my lungs before issuing the most important directive of all. I told Thomas to immediately access the master file for the Langdon Trust. I instructed him to draw up the necessary emergency paperwork to completely and permanently revoke my son's status as the sole beneficiary of my estate. I told Thomas about the horrifying medical conservatorship plot I had uncovered on the tablet upstairs. I explained how Derek and his new bride had actively conspired to weaponize the recent stroke of my wife to declare us both mentally incompetent. Thomas let out a low, disgusted breath. In all our years of battling ruthless corporate adversaries, he had never heard of a betrayal so intimately evil. I ordered him to establish an impenetrable legal firewall around my wife and me. I wanted the trust restructured so tightly that my son could never touch a single dime of our wealth, even if we were both incapacitated. I told him to reroute the inheritance entirely toward charitable foundations and specific medical research grants dedicated to stroke recovery. Derek wanted to use his mother's illness to steal a fortune, so that exact fortune would now be used to fund the cure for her illness. It was the ultimate, undeniable poetic justice. I instructed Thomas to have the preliminary trust revocation documents drafted, finalized, and ready for my signature by early Monday morning. But removing his access to future wealth was simply not enough. A crime had been committed against my company, against my employees, and against the integrity of everything I had built over the last 40 years. I gave Thomas the final, most devastating instruction. I told him to formally compile all the evidence regarding the fake warehouse project, the doctored vendor invoices, and the stolen $300,000. I ordered him to draft a comprehensive, formal criminal complaint for felony embezzlement. Thomas asked me if I was absolutely certain I wanted to pursue criminal charges against my own flesh and blood. He warned me that once we submitted that file to the Financial Crimes Division of the local authorities, there would be no going back. The state would take over the prosecution, and my son would face serious mandatory prison time. I did not blink. I did not hesitate. I stared at the heavy metal hinges of the fire door and told my lawyer that the man downstairs was no longer my son. He was a thief, a liability, and a dangerous predator who tried to destroy my wife. I wanted the criminal embezzlement file completed and officially submitted to the police department the moment their precinct doors opened on Monday morning. Thomas agreed without another word of hesitation. He promised me that the entire financial execution would be prepared and ready to launch before the weekend was over. I thanked him for his decades of unwavering loyalty and ended the phone call. I slipped the cellular phone back into the breast pocket of my suit. The trap was completely set. The legal guillotine was heavily suspended in the air, waiting for the rope to be cut. All I had to do now was survive the agonizing duration of the formal wedding reception. I pushed the heavy concrete stairwell door open, stepping back out into the bright, opulent hallway of the luxury venue. I smoothed my tie, straightened my posture, and began walking toward the grand ballroom to watch the magnificent destruction of the people who tried to ruin my family. They thought they could easily steal my empire while making a cruel mockery of my wife. They were about to learn a very painful lesson about the true cost of absolute betrayal today. The traditional wedding ceremony took place in the glass-enclosed conservatory just across the immaculate courtyard. I stood in the back row, watching the entire charade unfold, with a perfectly practiced smile plastered across my face. Derek and Natalie recited their handwritten vows under a canopy of imported white orchids. They spoke about unwavering loyalty, eternal devotion, and building a foundation of absolute trust. It took every ounce of discipline I had cultivated over 40 years in commercial construction to keep from laughing out loud. The sheer hypocrisy of their words was physically nauseating. They placed the platinum rings on each other's fingers, kissed for the cheering audience, and walked back down the aisle to thunderous applause. I clapped right along with the rest of the 300 oblivious guests. No one in that sunlit room had any idea that they were applauding a pair of ruthless corporate embezzlers. They did not know they were celebrating a couple who had actively conspired to emotionally destroy the fragile woman currently holding tightly to my left arm. As the classical string quartet concluded their final song, the massive crowd began a slow, elegant migration toward the grand ballroom for the evening reception. I guided Catherine through the bustling courtyard, keeping my pace slow and deliberate to accommodate her limited mobility. She leaned heavily on her polished wooden cane, her breath coming in shallow, exhausted increments. The physical toll of the long ceremony was already showing on her face, but she masked her discomfort behind a warm, polite smile. Guests stopped to greet us every few steps, offering their hollow congratulations and admiring the exorbitant scale of the event. I nodded and thanked them mentally, tallying the stolen funds surrounding us. I looked at the towering floral arrangements flanking the ballroom entrance. I looked at the liveried staff carrying silver trays of expensive vintage champagne. I looked at the custom ice sculptures melting slowly under the ambient lighting. My money had bought every single piece of this manufactured fairy tale. Derek had siphoned the lifeblood of my contracting empire to construct a monument to his own towering ego. But the time for reckoning was drawing incredibly close now. We stepped through the heavy oak doors and entered the magnificent grand ballroom. The space was a breathtaking display of opulent luxury, bathed in the soft, warm glow of the $15,000 lighting rig I had personally financed just a few months ago. The 300 guests quickly found their assigned tables, the room filling with a dull roar of elite social chatter and clinking crystal. I ignored the noise and focused entirely on the woman walking beside me. I guided Catherine directly toward the raised platform at the very front of the room. The sweetheart table sat in the center, flanked by the immediate family seating. I approached the velvet-cushioned chair bearing her gold-plated name tag. My heart maintained a cold, steady rhythm as I pulled the heavy mahogany frame back for her. I knew with absolute certainty that this specific cushion was completely clean, meticulously swapped by my own hands just hours before. Catherine turned around, slowly gripping the sturdy armrests for balance. She lowered herself gracefully onto the plush velvet fabric, letting out a quiet, relieved sigh as the soft material supported her aching back. I adjusted the flowing train of her beautiful $5,000 custom silk gown, ensuring the delicate fabric draped perfectly around her legs. I placed my hand gently on her shoulder, leaning down to whisper that she looked absolutely stunning tonight. She reached up and covered my rough, calloused hand with her own, her eyes shining with genuine gratitude. She felt so incredibly safe in that chair, completely unaware of the chemical nightmare that had been originally intended for her. The lively jazz band, stationed in the corner of the ballroom, suddenly transitioned into an upbeat, energetic melody. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone, his booming voice cutting through the ambient noise of the crowd. He enthusiastically asked the 300 seated guests to rise to their feet and welcome the new husband and wife. The grand double doors at the back of the room swung open dramatically. Derek and Natalie made their highly anticipated grand entrance, stepping into the sweeping spotlight to a deafening wave of applause and joyful cheering. Natalie looked like a flawless magazine cover model, beaming triumphantly as she waved to the wealthy audience. She was wearing a breathtaking custom-fitted Vera Wang bridal gown made of the finest imported Chantilly lace and cascading silk tulle. It was an $18,000 masterpiece of high-fashion design, and every single thread of that magnificent dress had been paid for by the fraudulent warehouse invoices Derek had buried in my corporate accounting ledgers. She was literally wearing the tangible evidence of my son's felony embezzlement. They walked confidently across the polished marble dance floor, basking in the stolen luxury that surrounded them on all sides. They approached the raised platform, waving one final time to the cheering crowd before turning to take their places at the decorated sweetheart table. I took my assigned seat directly to the right of Catherine, keeping my posture relaxed and my expression perfectly serene. I watched closely as Natalie approached her designated chair. The chair with the matching velvet cushion. The chair that was currently soaked deep to its core with industrial-grade heat-curing polyurethane adhesive. She grabbed the sides of her heavy, voluminous Vera Wang gown, lifting the delicate layers of expensive lace to avoid tripping. She smiled brightly for the designated wedding videographer, standing nearby, completely oblivious to the rugged dictaphone, secretly taping every word from directly beneath her. With a graceful, practiced movement, she lowered herself down. Her body weight pressed firmly into the thick velvet cushion. The trap was officially sprung. The chemical snare had successfully captured its intended prey. As soon as she settled into the seat, the mask of the radiant, joyful bride slipped for a fraction of a second. Natalie turned her head slightly, her gaze snapping directly toward Catherine. It was a venomous, predatory, and deeply expectant glare. She was looking at my wife like a butcher looks at a lamb eagerly waiting for the inevitable slaughter. She was mentally counting down the minutes until her vicious, humiliating spectacle would finally unfold. Natalie then shifted her gaze away from Catherine and looked directly at me. She expected to see a tired, clueless old man blindly enjoying his son's wedding. Instead, she found me staring right back at her with eyes as cold and unforgiving as shattered glass. I did not look away. I held her gaze with terrifying intensity. I slowly reached out and picked up my crystal flute of vintage champagne. I raised the glass smoothly in her direction, offering her a silent, chilling toast. A brief flash of genuine confusion flickered across her perfectly contoured face. She did not understand why I was looking at her like she was already a ghost. She quickly broke eye contact, turning back to smile at the crowd, shifting her body deeper into the toxic velvet cushion. The countdown had officially begun. She was completely unaware that every single minute she sat there smiling and drinking my stolen champagne, the chemical compound was actively sealing her spectacular ruin. The grand illusion of their perfect, untouchable life was about to violently shatter into a million broken pieces. The grand illusion of their perfect, untouchable life was about to violently shatter into a million broken pieces. The first course of the lavish dinner was served with impeccable precision by a fleet of waiters in crisp white jackets. They moved through the grand ballroom like clockwork, placing plates of imported caviar and seared scallops in front of the 300 distinguished guests. I looked down at the expensive appetizer resting on the gold-rimmed china in front of me. It was a culinary masterpiece, and every single bite was funded by the fraudulent warehouse invoices Derek had buried deeply in my corporate ledgers. I picked up my silver fork and began to eat, chewing slowly, savoring the bitter irony of the moment. Across the large circular table, Natalie was laughing loudly at a joke made by one of her bridesmaids. She leaned back heavily into her chair, pressing the intricate layers of her $18,000 Vera Wang gown firmly against the plush velvet cushion. She had absolutely no idea that a silent, invisible chemical reaction had already begun directly beneath her. Industrial grade, polyurethane, adhesive is an incredibly resilient compound. It is designed to withstand extreme weather conditions, heavy machinery vibrations, and the brutal wear and tear of active commercial construction sites. But its most dangerous property is how it cures. It requires a catalyst to transition from a thick, tacky gel into an immovable, solid block of concrete. That catalyst is heat. As Natalie sat there enjoying her stolen luxury, the natural warmth radiating from her body passed through the delicate silk tulle and chantilly lace of her expensive dress. That body heat seeped directly into the velvet cushion, activating the dormant adhesive I had swapped into her designated spot. I watched her take a quick sip of her champagne, shifting her weight slightly to the left. The microscopic fibers of her designer gown were already fusing permanently with the thick, toxic gel. An hour slowly ticked by. The second course of filet mignon and roasted asparagus was cleared away, replaced by towering silver trays of artisan desserts. I maintained polite conversation with the wealthy investors seated at the adjacent tables, projecting the image of a proud, relaxed patriarch. Beside me, Catherine was enjoying her evening immensely. She complimented the floral arrangements and smiled warmly at the jazz band playing softly in the corner. She looked so incredibly beautiful, and more importantly, she was completely safe. I glanced back over at the sweetheart table. The curing process was entering its final, most aggressive stage. The adhesive was no longer a sticky gel. It was rapidly hardening, binding the fabric of the dress to the chair with the strength of industrial mortar. I noticed Natalie beginning to shift uncomfortably. She reached behind her back, tugging subtly at the side of her waist. She leaned over and whispered something into the ear of my son. Her face pinched into a tight expression of mild annoyance. She clearly felt the restricting pull of the adhesive, but her vanity blinded her to the true nature of the problem. She undoubtedly assumed that the rigid custom boning of her high-fashion corset was simply digging into her ribs after a heavy meal. She tried to slide her hips forward to relieve the strange tension, but her body barely moved. The fabric was already anchored to the seat. She frowned, adjusting her posture by rolling her shoulders forward, unknowingly pressing the lower half of her dress even deeper into the hardening chemical snare. I took another slow sip of my vintage champagne, watching the magnificent trap lock its jaws shut. The ambient chatter of the grand ballroom began to fade as the master of ceremonies stepped back up to the microphone. He tapped his crystal glass, signaling the formal conclusion of the dinner service. The time for the traditional wedding speeches had officially arrived. The room fell into a respectful, hushed silence. Derek pushed his chair back and stood up. He grabbed the wireless microphone and stepped confidently to the front of the raised platform. He looked out over the sea of 300 elite guests, projecting an aura of absolute authority and responsible maturity. He was a phenomenal actor, a man who could lie with such profound sincerity that it genuinely terrified me to witness it in person. He began his speech by thanking the guests for traveling from across the country to celebrate this monumental milestone in his life. He spoke about the challenges of building a future, the value of hard work, and the importance of establishing a solid foundation. Then Derek turned his body and looked directly at our table. He locked eyes with me. His gaze was steady, unwavering, and filled with a dark, predatory confidence. He raised his glass toward Catherine and me. "I want to take a special moment to honor my parents," he announced, his voice echoing loudly through the state-of-the-art sound system I had paid for. "They have shown me what it means to weather the difficult storms of life. Recently, our family faced a terrifying medical challenge. My mother suffered a stroke, and it reminded all of us just how fragile life truly is." He paused dramatically, letting the guests murmur in sympathetic agreement. He looked at Catherine with a sickening expression of fake sorrow. Then his eyes snapped back to mine. "It taught me that the most important duty of a son is to protect the ones he loves when they are at their most vulnerable. Sometimes, protecting your family means making incredibly difficult decisions to ensure they are properly cared for when they can no longer care for themselves." The audacity of his words felt like a physical strike. To the guests in the grand ballroom, Derek sounded like a fiercely loyal son stepping up to bear the burden of a family tragedy. But I knew exactly what he was actually saying. I had read the emails on his tablet. I had seen the medical dossiers and the messages sent to the estate lawyer. He was establishing the narrative for the conservatorship. He was laying the groundwork to declare us mentally and physically incompetent. I was telling me to my face that he was going to strip away my rights and steal the Langdon Trust. He expected me to sit there, clueless and vulnerable, absorbing his sweet words while he sharpened the knife he planned to bury in my back. I did not break eye contact. I did not flinch, and I certainly did not let a single ounce of my simmering rage show on my face. Instead, I smiled. It was a warm, proud, perfectly constructed fatherly smile. I raised my hands and began to clap. I applauded his magnificent performance with slow, deliberate strikes of my palms. The rest of the ballroom immediately joined in creating a thunderous wave of applause for the dutiful, caring son. Derek smirked, satisfied with his manipulation. He thought he had completely dominated the psychological chess match. He believed he was the smartest man in the room, effortlessly controlling the board. He had absolutely no idea that he was a dead man walking. The 2 hours of the formal dinner service had officially come to an end. The plates were cleared, the speeches concluded, and the polyurethane adhesive finished its silent chemical reaction. The delicate chantilly lace of the custom Vera Wang bridal gown was permanently, irreversibly fused to the plush velvet cushion. The ticking clock had finally run out. The applause for Derek slowly faded into a quiet, expectant murmur as he proudly took his seat back at the sweetheart table. The grand illusion was perfectly intact for just a few more fleeting seconds. The master of ceremonies stepped forward once again, his booming voice cutting through the soft, ambient music playing in the background. He invited the guests to turn their attention back to the center of the room. It was time for the bride and groom to share their very first dance as husband and wife. The massive crystal chandeliers suspended from the high ceiling suddenly dimmed, casting the sprawling ballroom into a dramatic romantic twilight. A single brilliant white spotlight cut through the darkness, illuminating the sweetheart table where my son and his new bride were seated. Derek smiled handsomely for the hundreds of cameras pointed directly at him. He stood up with effortless grace, casually buttoning his tailored tuxedo jacket, projecting the flawless image of a wealthy, successful patriarch in the making. He turned toward Natalie, extending his right hand to gently guide his beautiful bride out onto the polished marble dance floor. I sat perfectly still beside Catherine, my breathing slow and measured, watching the final act of their malicious stage play unfold. Natalie beamed under the bright glare of the spotlight. She placed her manicured hand delicately into the waiting palm of my son. She adjusted the heavy cascading layers of her expensive silk tulle skirt with her free hand, preparing to rise with the elegant poise of a high society princess. She engaged her leg muscles and shifted her weight forward to stand. She did not move. Her body remained firmly anchored to the seat. For a brief, confusing second, her flawless smile faltered. She blinked, looking down at her lap, clearly assuming that a heavy fold of her voluminous skirt had somehow become wedged tightly beneath the leg of the chair, or caught awkwardly under the heel of her designer shoe. She let go of the hand Derek was offering and reached down to adjust the excess fabric pooling around her waist. Derek leaned down slightly, his brow furrowing in mild confusion, whispering a hurried question to her. She shook her head quickly, forcing her bright smile back onto her face for the sake of the recording videographers standing just a few feet away. She gripped the sturdy wooden edge of the sweetheart table, with both hands bracing her arms to push herself up forcefully. Natalie pushed her body upward with a sudden, determined heave. The thick velvet cushion did not surrender its grip. The industrial-grade polyurethane adhesive had cured into an unbreakable concrete bond, permanently welding the delicate chantilly lace of her designer gown directly to the upholstery. Because her upper body moved forward, while her lower half remained hopelessly trapped, the sheer force of her momentum caused the heavy mahogany chair to tilt forward precariously on its front legs. She gasped loudly, her eyes widening in sudden, unadulterated panic as she slammed her hands back down onto the table to stop herself from falling over. The heavy chair clattered back onto all four legs with a dull, heavy thud. The flawless facade of the radiant bride instantly shattered. The color completely drained from her carefully contoured face, replaced by a pale, sickly sheen of absolute terror. She was no longer smiling. She twisted her torso frantically, trying to look over her own shoulder to see what was holding her down. Derek grabbed her arm, his voice rising in panicked, hushed demands, completely oblivious to the inescapable chemical snare holding his wife hostage. He yanked her arm, trying to physically pull her up to her feet to avoid causing a humiliating scene in front of their wealthy guests. The spotlight continued to beat down on them mercilessly. 300 elite guests sat in absolute breathless silence, holding their glowing smartphones up to record what was supposed to be a romantic fairy tale moment. Instead, they were watching a bride engage in a frantic, desperate wrestling match with a piece of banquet furniture. Natalie was hyperventilating now. The pressure of the thousands of eyes watching her completely broke her fragile composure. She looked out into the darkness of the ballroom, her terrified gaze locking onto mine for a fraction of a second. I did not offer her a single ounce of sympathy. I simply raised my chin, my expression as cold and unyielding as a stone monument, driven by sheer blind panic and the agonizing embarrassment of the prolonged delay. She planted both of her feet firmly against the polished marble floor. She let out a frustrated, breathless cry and threw her entire body weight violently forward in one massive, forceful heave. The structural integrity of the $18,000 custom wedding gown finally surrendered to the ruthless grip of the cured commercial adhesive. The sound was absolutely deafening in the quiet ballroom. A sharp, violent tearing noise echoed sharply through the room. The exquisite imported silk and the hand-stitched lace shredded violently right down the center seam. The fabric gave way completely, ripping forcefully from the middle of her spine all the way down past her thighs. The sudden release of tension sent Natalie pitching wildly forward. Her hands slipped off the edge of the sweetheart table, sending crystal champagne flutes and silverware crashing loudly onto the floor. She tumbled over the edge of the raised platform, plunging downward in a chaotic tangle of shredded white silk and broken tulle. She slammed onto the polished marble dance floor with a heavy, painful thud. The heavy mahogany chair, still permanently cemented to the entire back half of her ruined designer dress, flipped over and dragged across the carpet, resting awkwardly on its side just above her. A collective, horrified gasp erupted simultaneously from 300 people. It was a massive wave of pure shock that washed over the entire ballroom. Natalie lay sprawled on the cold floor, completely exposed to the merciless glare of the bright white spotlight. The bottom half of her dress was utterly destroyed, completely sheared away, leaving her lying there in nothing but her sheer minimal undergarments. The exact devastating public humiliation she had so gleefully plotted to inflict upon my disabled, vulnerable wife had just swallowed her entirely. Flashes from hundreds of smartphone cameras illuminated the dark room like lightning strikes in a violent storm. The social elite of the city were actively recording her absolute degradation, capturing every single pathetic, humiliating detail for the entire world to see. Derek stood frozen at the sweetheart table, his mouth hanging open in complete paralyzed shock. He looked down at his new bride, sobbing hysterically on the marble floor, and then he slowly turned his head to look directly at me. He finally understood that the clueless old man he thought he was effortlessly manipulating had just executed a flawless, ruthless demolition of his entire life. The music from the live jazz band sputtered to a discordant, painful halt. I sat perfectly still and felt an incredible surge of fierce, unapologetic satisfaction coursing through my veins. The elaborate trap they had so carefully constructed out of raw greed, sheer cruelty, and unbridled arrogance had finally snapped shut on their own necks. Natalie scrambled frantically on the cold marble floor, sobbing hysterically, as she tried desperately to pull the tattered, ruined shreds of her expensive gown over her exposed legs. But the heavy wooden chair remained stubbornly glued to her back, mocking her every single pathetic movement. The absolute pandemonium that erupted across the grand ballroom was unlike anything I had ever witnessed in my 4 decades of managing chaotic construction sites. The initial wave of stunned silence instantly shattered, replaced by a deafening chorus of gasps, panicked shouts, and the relentless clicking of hundreds of smartphone cameras. The city elite were not accustomed to witnessing such raw, unfiltered degradation, and human nature compelled them to record every single second of it. Natalie continued to thrash wildly on the polished marble floor, her desperate movements only amplifying the sickening tearing sounds of the remaining silk clinging to the heavy wooden chair. 2 of her bridesmaids finally snapped out of their paralyzed shock. They rushed forward, grabbing a long white linen table runner from a nearby dining table. They threw the thick fabric over the lower half of Natalie, desperately trying to shield her exposed undergarments from the unforgiving glare of the spotlight and the flashing lenses of the crowd. Derek was completely frantic. The carefully crafted mask of the confident, wealthy groom had completely evaporated, leaving behind a terrified, scrambling fraud. He dropped to his knees on the dance floor, grabbing Natalie by the shoulders and attempting to pull her up. But the sheer weight of the mahogany chair, still permanently cemented to her backside by the cured industrial adhesive, made the process incredibly awkward and physically demanding. Every time he tried to lift her, the chair dragged heavily against the floor, pulling the remaining shreds of her expensive designer gown even tighter against her skin. She shrieked in absolute agony and humiliation, slapping his hands away as she begged someone to just turn off the blinding lights. Derek shouted furious, incoherent orders at the venue staff, demanding they stop recording and clear a path to the exit. He grabbed Natalie by the arm, half lifting and half dragging her off the dance floor. It was a pathetic, humiliating retreat. Natalie was forced to waddle forward in a hunched, awkward stance, clutching the linen table runner around her waist, while the heavy banquet chair bobbed and swayed behind her like a grotesque wooden tail. They pushed their way blindly through the crowd of whispering guests, leaving a trail of shredded white silk and scattered velvet fibers in their wake. They headed straight for the grand staircase leading to the private bridal suites on the 2nd floor, desperate to escape the merciless scrutiny of the ballroom. I sat at the sweetheart table for a moment longer, calmly taking a final sip of my vintage champagne. I turned to Catherine, who was sitting perfectly safe and secure in her own seat, her eyes wide with shock at the disastrous spectacle that had just occurred. I gently patted her hand, offering her a reassuring nod. I told her to remain comfortably at the table with our trusted friends, assuring her that I would go upstairs to handle the situation. I stood up from my chair, smoothing down the front of my tailored suit jacket. I walked away from the chaos of the dance floor, taking measured, deliberate steps toward the grand staircase. I did not rush. A man who holds all the winning cards never needs to run. I climbed the marble steps, following the distinct sounds of hysterical sobbing and furious shouting echoing down the 2nd floor hallway. I reached the heavy wooden door of the private bridal suite. It had been left wide open in their frantic rush to hide. I stepped into the doorway and observed the absolute wreckage of their perfect evening. The scene inside the suite was a portrait of total, pathetic despair. Natalie was lying face down on a plush leather sofa, her face buried deeply in a decorative pillow as she wailed uncontrollably. The heavy mahogany chair was sticking straight up into the air above her, an absurd monument to her own spectacular failure. Her mother, who had rushed upstairs right behind them, was standing over her in a state of absolute frenzy. She was holding a pair of sharp floral scissors she had snatched from a decorative arrangement in the hallway. She was desperately hacking away at the thick velvet cushion and the ruined layers of the Vera Wang gown, trying in vain to separate the fabric from the cured polyurethane. But industrial-grade construction adhesive does not yield to simple floral scissors. It binds fibers on a microscopic level, The more she cut, the more the dress simply unraveled, leaving the core of the fabric permanently fused to the wood and velvet. Derek was pacing furiously back and forth across the length of the bridal suite, running his trembling hands through his perfectly styled hair. His breathing was heavy and ragged, his face flushed with a mixture of profound embarrassment and boiling anger. He was searching for an outlet for his rage, someone to blame for the catastrophic destruction of his carefully manufactured public image. He stopped his pacing the exact moment he saw me standing quietly in the doorway. The fear in his eyes was instantly replaced by a desperate, aggressive defensiveness. He needed a scapegoat, and he automatically assumed I was still the clueless, accommodating father he could easily manipulate and intimidate. He stormed across the room, stopping just a few feet away from me. He pointed a shaking finger directly at my chest, his voice rising into a sharp, accusatory shout. "Look what your venue did!" he yelled, his face twisting with manufactured outrage. "Look at what happened to her dress. You picked this place. You paid for these cheap, defective chairs. You completely ruined our wedding. You let this happen to us." He stood there, panting, puffing out his chest, trying to assert his dominance in the room. He expected me to immediately apologize. He expected me to stumble over my words, to offer to sue the catering company, to pull out my checkbook and blindly throw more money at the problem, to make his bride stop crying. He relied on my decades of unconditional paternal support to shield him from the consequences of this disaster. I did not apologize. I did not offer a single word of comfort. I simply looked at his pointing finger, and then I looked directly into his panicked, deceitful eyes. I maintained my absolute silence, allowing his furious accusations to hang empty and hollow in the tense air of the suite. I stepped fully into the room, moving past him with calm, deliberate authority. I reached out and took hold of the heavy wooden door. I pulled it shut. I engaged the thick brass deadbolt. The loud, heavy metallic click of the lock snapping firmly into place echoed sharply through the room. It was a definitive, inescapable sound. I turned around and leaned my back against the locked door, crossing my arms over my chest. I allowed the cold, unforgiving reality of my demeanor to completely fill the space. The effect was absolutely immediate and profound. The heavy click of the lock seemed to instantly suck all the remaining oxygen straight out of the bridal suite. Natalie stopped her hysterical wailing, lifting her tear-stained face from the decorative pillow to stare at me in sudden confusion. Her mother froze mid-motion, the sharp floral scissors halting completely in her trembling hands. Derek dropped his shaking finger, the aggressive posture melting away from his shoulders as he registered the terrifying shift in my body language. The room fell completely dead silent. The silence inside the private bridal suite was absolute and suffocating. No one dared to breathe. I stood with my back firmly pressed against the locked wooden door for a few seconds longer, letting the oppressive weight of my silent authority crush their frantic panic into submission. I pushed myself away from the heavy doorframe and walked slowly toward the center of the lavishly decorated room. I did not raise my voice. I did not shout or curse or throw things in a fit of blind rage. A man who holds all the undeniable evidence in his hands never needs to raise his voice to command the attention of the room. I walked right past the terrified mother of the bride. I walked right past my trembling, sweating son. I stopped directly in front of the large flat-screen smart television securely mounted on the far wall of the bridal suite. I reached into my tailored suit jacket and pulled out my smartphone, tapping the digital screen a few times to access the wireless display settings. A quiet, pleasant chime echoed clearly through the tense room as my personal device successfully paired with the television monitor. I reached into my opposite pocket and pulled out the heavy-duty job site dictaphone I had retrieved from under the sweetheart table during the chaotic aftermath of the dress-tearing incident. I held the rugged black recording device up high in the air, so absolutely everyone in the room could see it clearly. I explained in a low, perfectly even, and dangerously calm tone that I had personally placed this highly sensitive recording equipment directly beneath their designated chairs right before the evening reception officially began. Derek swallowed incredibly hard, his throat bobbing nervously as the remaining color continued to rapidly drain from his panicked face. I connected the dictaphone to my mobile phone via a small corded adapter and routed the audio directly through the premium surround sound speakers installed in the ceiling of the bridal suite. I firmly pressed the play button. The pristine high-definition audio recording instantly filled the painfully quiet room. The ambient sound of clinking silverware and distant live jazz music provided a steady background for the clear, unmistakable, and highly incriminating voices of my son and his new bride. The recording started near the very end of the formal dinner service. Natalie spoke first, her voice echoing loudly through the speakers, heavily laced with bitter, entitled, and arrogant annoyance. She complained aggressively that she was feeling much too warm and that her custom-fitted corset was entirely too tight against her ribs. And then came the horrifying, malicious words that made her own mother gasp loudly and cover her mouth in absolute visceral shock. "I am so tired of waiting." The recorded voice of Natalie whined loudly for the entire room to hear. "Why has she not stood up to go to the restroom yet? I thought you said she had severe bladder control issues. I cannot wait around all night for this pathetic stroke victim to finally embarrass herself." The bridal suite went completely, terrifyingly rigid. I watched the father of the bride take a slow, stumbling step backward, as if he had been physically struck by the sheer, unadulterated cruelty radiating from his daughter. But it was the immediate response from Derek that truly sealed their permanent, inescapable doom. His recorded voice chuckled softly, a dark, sinister sound projecting through the high-quality speakers. "Just be patient," my son replied confidently on the digital tape. "The longer she sits there, the tighter the chemical bond gets. Once she finally stands up, she is going to rip herself wide open. Just make sure your camera is completely ready. We need that massive public meltdown captured on video for the lawyer tomorrow morning." I pressed pause on the rugged dictaphone. The heavy silence that immediately followed was toxic and heavily loaded with the horrifying realization of their true predatory nature. Natalie let out a pathetic, muffled sob from the plush leather sofa. But absolutely nobody rushed forward to offer her any comfort this time. Her mother slowly lowered the sharp floral scissors, staring down at her ruined, half-naked daughter, as if she were looking at a complete, terrifying stranger. Derek opened his mouth, raising his shaking hands in a desperate, trembling gesture of pathetic surrender. He stammered wildly, trying desperately to claim that it was just dark humor, just a terrible private joke blown entirely out of proportion by a massive misunderstanding. I did not even let him finish his pathetic, rambling, and cowardly sentence. I tapped the screen of my smartphone again, opening the highly encrypted photo gallery, where I had uploaded the digital evidence recovered from his tablet earlier that afternoon. I mirrored the captured images directly onto the massive television screen. The bright, glaring display of their private text messages suddenly illuminated the dark bridal suite for everyone to read clearly. I pointed a firm, unwavering finger at the television screen, demanding that the parents of the bride read the exact words their daughter had actively typed with her own hands. There was the unmistakable message from Natalie, explicitly plotting to humiliate my disabled wife in front of 300 high society guests to secure a massive, unethical legal advantage. There was the cold, calculating, and ruthless response from Derek, mapping out the devastating financial and legal consequences of their planned public spectacle. I swiped to the next saved image on my phone, displaying the lengthy, detailed email thread with the boutique estate attorney. I read the damning words aloud, ensuring. My steady, powerful voice carried the full, crushing weight of a Supreme Court judge delivering a final, inescapable verdict to the guilty. Combine that video with her stroke medical records, and my lawyer says we have a slam-dunk case for a conservatorship, and I read aloud, my voice completely devoid of any paternal warmth, forgiveness, or affection. We declare Mom mentally and physically incompetent. Dad will be so broken by the public humiliation he will not fight it. We force him to hand over the trust to me immediately today. I swiped to the final, most devastating screenshot available in my gallery. The vile, greedy words were blown up to massive proportions on the television screen, completely dominating the entire room with their ruthless, unapologetic honesty. I cannot wait 20 years for him to die. The parents of Natalie stood completely frozen, in horrified, breathless silence, as the true sociopathic nature of their daughter and their new son-in-law was broadcasted in inescapable, crystal-clear high definition. They had spent the last entire year loudly bragging to their wealthy socialite friends about this incredibly affluent, prestigious, and highly exclusive family union. Now they were staring directly at a pair of ruthless, predatory monsters who had actively conspired to destroy an elderly, vulnerable couple just to steal their massive fortune. The mother of Natalie slowly backed away from the plush leather sofa where her daughter was still crying uncontrollably into a decorative pillow. She looked absolutely repulsed, utterly disgusted by the vile, calculating creature she had raised. The father of the bride shook his head in silent, profound shame, unable to even look me in the eye. Derek stood entirely defeated in the very center of the bridal suite. His broad shoulders slumped forward heavily, his chest heaving rapidly as the inescapable gravity of his immense public exposure finally crushed him down to absolutely nothing. The arrogant, wealthy, and highly confident groom was completely gone forever. In his place stood a pathetic, exposed, and incredibly vulnerable fraud who had just watched his entire master plan burn to useless, scattered ashes right in front of his very own eyes. He realized instantly that every single layer of his elaborate evil deception had been methodically dismantled by the very man he had arrogantly dismissed as a clueless old fool. The absolute finality of the terrifying moment hung heavily over the room, leaving no room for excuses, fake apologies, or desperate negotiations. The brilliant, malicious trap they had designed to capture my innocent wife had simply become the highly secure, inescapable prison of their own making. I lowered my smartphone, keeping my cold eyes locked on my trembling, broken son, thoroughly preparing myself to deliver the final, crushing financial blow that would permanently end his life. The heavy silence in the bridal suite was broken by the sound of my son, choking on his own breath. Derek took a trembling step forward, his hands raised in a pathetic, pleading gesture. He looked desperately at the blank television screen, then back at me, his face glistening with cold sweat. "Dad, wait," he stammered, his voice cracking into a high, panicked pitch that I had not heard since he was a little boy caught breaking a window. "You are taking this entirely out of context. Those messages, the things we said about Mom, they were just jokes. It was just dark humor. We were stressed about the wedding planning, and we were just venting our frustrations. We would never actually do something like that to her. We would never actually try to take your money." I watched him desperately trying to construct a new, plausible lie right in front of the very people who had just watched his absolute moral bankruptcy displayed in high definition. It was truly pathetic to witness. I did not raise my voice, but my tone was sharp enough to cut through solid steel. "Do not insult my intelligence, Derek," I said slowly, taking a deliberate step toward him. "You did not just joke about destroying your mother. You actively retained a boutique estate attorney. You illegally acquired her private medical records. You meticulously orchestrated a highly public, deeply humiliating physical trap to manufacture the exact visual evidence your lawyer requested. You built a guillotine, you sharpened the blade, and you placed her neck directly on the block. There is absolutely no context in the universe that justifies what you did today." Derek opened his mouth to argue frantically, shaking his head, but his words died in his throat as I reached into the interior pocket of my tailored suit jacket. I did not pull out another digital device. I pulled out a thick, neatly folded stack of printed documents. I walked over to the marble-topped vanity where Natalie had spent the morning preparing for her fraudulent fairy tale. I slammed the stack of papers down onto the smooth marble surface. The sharp smack made everyone in the room flinch simultaneously. Natalie let out a quiet, terrified whimper from the leather sofa, clutching the stolen white table runner tightly against her chest. I turned back to my son, my eyes blazing with the fierce, protective fury of a man who had spent 4 decades bleeding to build a commercial empire. If you thought your medical conservatorship plot was the only secret I uncovered today, you are vastly underestimating the man who taught you how to read a balance sheet, I stated firmly. While you were busy taking wedding photographs in the garden this afternoon, I was actively auditing your corporate email accounts. I watched the blood drain from the face of my son. He swayed slightly on his feet, his knees visibly buckling under the sudden crushing weight of his exposed financial crimes. He knew exactly what was printed on those papers resting on the vanity. He knew that his incredibly sloppy, arrogant accounting trail had finally caught up with him. I pointed to the stack of documents, ensuring my voice remained loud enough for the parents of the bride to hear every single devastating word. Those papers contain the complete itemized vendor invoices for this lavish $300,000 wedding reception, I announced clearly. And they also contain the fraudulent corporate budgets for a completely fabricated industrial warehouse project on the west side of the city. I watched the father of the bride turn his shocked gaze toward Derek. You did not pay for this wedding with your personal savings, Derek. And your new bride certainly did not pay for it with her imaginary family wealth. You systematically embezzled hundreds of thousands of dollars directly from my commercial operational accounts. You fraudulently mislabeled floral arrangements as heavy-duty landscaping. You expensed a custom designer wedding gown as industrial steel scaffolding. You actively committed massive corporate felony embezzlement to buy the approval of a woman who was eagerly plotting to destroy your own mother. Derek was physically shaking now, his entire body trembling as the catastrophic reality of his situation closed in around him. Dad, please, he begged, his voice dropping into a pathetic, desperate whisper. I can pay it back. I will work overtime. I will give you my entire salary. Just keep this in the family. Do not let the partners find out. I crossed my arms over my chest, looking at him with absolute freezing contempt. There is no salary for you to give me, Derek, I replied coldly. While you were busy putting on your expensive tuxedo, I was on a private phone call with Thomas. The mere mention of my ruthless corporate attorney made Derek physically recoil. He knew perfectly well that Thomas was a legal shark who took absolute pleasure in destroying corporate liabilities. Thomas has spent the last hour executing a complete and total financial lockdown, I informed him. Every single joint operational account you had access to is completely frozen. Your administrative privileges on the servers have been permanently revoked. Your high-limit company credit cards are currently dead, useless pieces of plastic. You are terminated from your position as Regional Vice President of Operations effective immediately. You no longer work for me, and you no longer represent my company at all. Natalie let out a loud, devastated wail from the sofa, realizing that the endless river of wealth she thought she had married into had just run completely dry. Derek dropped to his knees on the carpeted floor of the bridal suite, his hands clutching the sides of his head in a portrait of total, unadulterated despair. But I was not finished. I stepped closer to him, towering over his kneeling form, ensuring that my final words would be permanently burned into his memory. But firing you is simply an administrative necessity, I continued, my voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. A crime has been committed against my company, and I do not sweep felony embezzlement under the rug to protect a thief, even if that thief shares my last name. Thomas is currently compiling the fraudulent invoices and the fake project budgets into a comprehensive formal criminal complaint. That detailed file will be sitting on the desk of the Financial Crimes Division of the Police Department the moment their doors open on Monday morning. Derek looked up at me, his eyes wide with a terror so profound it almost looked like madness. Dad. No, he cried out, tears finally spilling down his cheeks. You cannot send me to prison. I am your only son. You cannot do this to me. I looked down at him, feeling absolutely no pity, no regret, and no hesitation. You made your choices, Derek. You decided that money was more important than the safety of your own mother. You decided that my lifetime of hard work was just a resource for you to steal. You wanted to play the role of a ruthless predator, but you were nothing more than a sloppy, arrogant amateur. I leaned down slightly, bringing my face closer to his, delivering the final, inescapable verdict that would permanently end his life as he knew it. You wanted to declare someone incompetent to steal a fortune. I asked, my voice echoing through the silent, horrified room. Try doing that with a felony conviction. The weight of my final sentence hung heavily in the air. Derek stared up at me from his knees, his eyes wide with terror. The realization that his master plan had collapsed fractured his facade of arrogance. He reached out with trembling hands, grasping my tailored suit trousers. He begged me with a cracked voice, pleading for his freedom, pleading for the father he spent months plotting to destroy. Dad, please, you cannot do this. He sobbed, tears streaming down his pale cheeks. I am your flesh and blood. You cannot send your own son to federal prison. I will sign away my rights to the trust. Just please call Thomas and tell him to stop the criminal complaint. I looked down at the weeping man kneeling before me. For my entire adult life, I worked tirelessly to provide this boy with every conceivable advantage. I sacrificed my own time, energy, and peace of mind to ensure he would never experience the brutal hardships I faced, building my commercial contracting empire from the dirt up. I gave him the world on a silver platter, and he responded by attempting to construct a legal guillotine for my disabled wife. I searched my heart for a shred of paternal sympathy. I felt nothing. The well of unconditional love was bone dry. The pathetic man groveling at my feet was no longer my child. He was just a convicted felon waiting patiently for the police authorities to arrive today. I calmly reached down and peeled his trembling fingers off my trousers, brushing the fabric smooth with a deliberate, dismissive gesture. You lost the right to call yourself my son the moment you decided to weaponize the medical trauma of your mother for personal financial gain. I replied, my voice devoid of any warmth. You traded your family for a pile of stolen money and a fraudulent social status. You made your choice, Derek. Now you get to live with the harsh, unescapable consequences of your own terrible decisions. Across the room, Natalie let out another agonizing shriek. She was hopelessly tangled in the shredded remnants of her Vera Wang bridal gown, her body half attached to the heavy mahogany banquet chair. The industrial-grade polyurethane adhesive had cured completely, creating a permanent bond between the chantilly lace and the velvet cushion. She thrashed wildly on the plush leather sofa, demanding that her parents save her from this public disaster. But her parents were no longer interested. The father of the bride stared at his daughter with absolute disgust. He turned his back on the ruined bride, grabbed his wife by the arm, and silently pulled her toward the exit. They walked away, deeply ashamed of the monster they raised. Natalie realized that her wealthy safety net had evaporated. She realized that the massive fortune she thought she married into was gone. She realized she was about to face corporate embezzlement charges alongside a disgraced husband. She curled into a pathetic ball on the sofa, clutching the stolen white table runner tightly against her chest, permanently fused to the wooden monument of her own cruelty. I turned away from this pathetic scene in the center of the room. I walked slowly toward the heavy wooden door of the bridal suite. Derek scrambled across the carpeted floor behind me, his voice rising in a final desperate crescendo of pure panic. "Dad, do not walk out that door," he screamed, his voice cracking violently. "If you leave now, my life is completely over. Please, I am begging you, do not leave me here like this." I did not pause my stride. I reached out and firmly grasped the cold brass deadbolt I engaged just a few short minutes ago. I twisted the heavy metal mechanism, pulling the lock back with a sharp click. I grabbed the ornate handle and pulled the heavy door wide open, revealing the brightly lit hallway beyond. I did not look back over my shoulder. I did not offer a single word of farewell. I stepped out of the bridal suite and let the heavy wooden door swing shut behind me, severing my ties to that room and the people inside it permanently. I walked down the hallway, my head held high. I reached the marble staircase and began my descent. The chaotic atmosphere in the massive foyer had shifted significantly. The shock of the dramatic dress-tearing incident had morphed into a restless hive of wealthy socialites, whispering eagerly about the spectacular public ruin of the newlyweds. Groups of elegantly dressed guests stood in tight circles holding their smartphones, actively sharing the video footage of the bride crashing to the floor with a chair cemented to her back. I ignored the staring eyes and hushed whispers of the crowd. I walked with calm purpose through the towering floral arrangements and back into the grand ballroom. The live jazz band was packing up their brass instruments, the festive mood completely shattered by the earlier pandemonium. Waiters were silently clearing away the remaining crystal champagne flutes. I navigated through the labyrinth of circular dining tables, my eyes focused entirely on the raised platform at the very front of the sprawling room. Catherine was sitting perfectly upright in her designated chair, looking incredibly regal and fiercely composed, despite the madness swirling around her. Her beautiful custom silk gown draped flawlessly around her legs, completely untouched by the malicious chemical trap I successfully dismantled. She watched me approach, her kind eyes searching my face for a sign of distress. I reached the table and stopped directly in front of her. I offered her a warm, genuine, and deeply reassuring smile. I unbuttoned my tailored suit jacket and slipped it off my shoulders. I draped the heavy fabric carefully around her delicate shoulders. I leaned down, pressing a soft kiss against her forehead. "Are you ready to go home, my love?" I asked quietly. She reached up and patted my cheek. "I am perfectly ready," she replied, her voice steady. She grabbed her polished wooden cane and pushed herself up from the table. She stood tall and strong, free from the toxic snare they laid for her. I offered her my arm. She linked her hand through mine. We turned our backs on the lavish sweetheart table, walking slowly down the center aisle of the grand ballroom. The remaining guests parted like the sea, offering us a wide path to the exit. We stepped out through the heavy oak doors, walking into the cool night air, leaving the whispers, the shattered silk, and the burning ruins of my son's life far behind us in the dark forever. Exactly 1 year has passed since that night at the grand ballroom. The crisp night air that greeted Catherine and me as we walked out of the luxury venue felt like the very first breath of a completely new life. When you spend 4 decades building a commercial contracting empire, you become accustomed to the heavy, relentless weight of constant responsibility. You condition yourself to carry the massive burdens of your employees, your active construction sites, and your ungrateful family members without ever daring to complain. But as the heavy oak doors closed behind us, sealing the disastrous wedding reception away forever, that suffocating weight finally lifted from my tired shoulders. I realized that my profound obligation to protect and provide for my son had officially expired. He was no longer my responsibility. He was simply a hostile adversary who had deeply underestimated his opponent. The following Monday morning, I did exactly what I promised. Thomas, my ruthless corporate attorney, walked straight into the financial crimes division of the local police department and handed over the comprehensive embezzlement file. The authorities moved with terrifying speed. While the detectives began building their airtight criminal case against my son, I initiated a massive strategic shift in my own professional life. For years, I had held on to Langdon commercial contracting because I believed I was building a generational legacy to pass down to Derek. With that toxic illusion permanently shattered, there was absolutely no reason to keep grinding myself down in the demanding world of commercial construction. I quietly put my entire company up for sale. Because the business was highly profitable, fundamentally sound, and completely purged of the financial rot Derek had temporarily introduced, it attracted multiple aggressive buyers within weeks. I eventually sold the corporation to a massive national development conglomerate for a staggering 8-figure profit. I took that influx of liquid capital, combined it with my existing wealth, and completely restructured the Langdon Trust. I ensured that the financial firewall Thomas built around Catherine and me was absolutely impenetrable. While I was busy liquidating my assets and securing a stress-free retirement, Derek was experiencing the brutal, unforgiving reality of the criminal justice system. The formal investigation into his fraudulent warehouse project was swift and devastating. The digital paper trail he left behind was incredibly sloppy, a clear testament to his blinding arrogance. He had genuinely believed that simply hiding behind my forged signature would shield him from all accountability. Instead, it provided the federal prosecutors with a perfect, undeniable timeline of his felony embezzlement. When the authorities presented him with the overwhelming mountain of financial evidence, his expensive defense attorney advised him to take a plea deal. Derek ultimately pleaded guilty to multiple counts of corporate fraud and grand theft. He is currently sitting in a federal holding facility, awaiting his final sentencing hearing next month. The presiding judge has already indicated that he is facing a mandatory minimum sentence of 7 to 10 years in federal prison. There will be no leniency, no wealthy father swooping in to pay his restitution, and no luxurious safety net waiting for him when he finally gets out. He traded a lifetime of guaranteed security and family support for a few months of stolen luxury and the sickening thrill of plotting against his own mother. I is now learning the profound difference between a temporary victory and a permanent, devastating defeat. Natalie did not fare much better in the aftermath of her spectacular public humiliation. The moment she realized that Derek had been completely cut off from the Langdon fortune, her shallow, opportunistic devotion completely evaporated. She filed for a rapid divorce just 3 weeks after the disastrous wedding reception, desperately trying to legally distance herself from his pending criminal charges and his massive financial liabilities. However, her cowardly attempt to save herself did not protect her from the crushing weight of her own terrible decisions. Because the fraudulent funds Derek used to pay for the extravagant wedding were seized and reclaimed by the authorities during the corporate audit, Natalie and her pretentious parents were suddenly held legally responsible for the outstanding vendor balances. She is currently drowning in insurmountable debt, being relentlessly pursued by aggressive collection agencies for the canceled honeymoon packages and the ruined $18,000 designer gown. She lost her social standing, her wealthy lifestyle, and her pristine public image in one single humiliating evening. She is now a social pariah in the city, forever remembered as the malicious bride who ended up physically cemented to a banquet chair in her undergarments. As for Catherine and me, we chose to completely leave the toxicity and the legal drama far behind us. We are currently sitting on the private balcony of a luxury suite aboard a magnificent cruise ship, sailing slowly across the crystal-clear sapphire waters of the Mediterranean Sea. The warm ocean breeze carries the scent of salt and freedom, a beautiful contrast to the heavy toxic air of our former lives. Catherine has made a remarkable, inspiring recovery over the past 12 months. Freed from the dark, suffocating stress and the malicious, unseen pressure our son constantly placed upon her, her physical therapy progressed with incredible speed. She no longer needs her wooden cane to walk around the deck of the ship. She moves with a renewed, vibrant strength, her beautiful face illuminated by genuine happiness and profound peace. We spend our days exploring ancient coastal cities, tasting incredible food, and enjoying the immense wealth we built together over 40 long years. We are completely untethered from the greedy leeches that tried to drain our resources and destroy our dignity. Sitting here, watching the vibrant sunset paint the horizon in brilliant shades of gold and crimson, I've come to a quiet, powerful realization about the true nature of family. Blood is nothing more than a mere biological coincidence. It does not automatically guarantee unconditional love. It does not mandate blind respect, and it certainly does not ever excuse profound, calculated abuse against vulnerable people. True family is built entirely on a solid, unbreakable foundation of unwavering loyalty, deep mutual respect, and an instinctual, fierce drive to protect one another from any incoming harm. Catherine and I built a beautiful, enduring, and incredibly successful life together through decades of shared sacrifice and mutual devotion. We successfully defended that precious life when it was violently threatened by the very person who should have cherished, honored, and protected it the absolute most. We survived the storm, and now we finally get to enjoy the beautiful, peaceful sunshine. Sometimes the people who share your blood are the ones most willing to bleed you dry. We spend our lives building a legacy blinded by unconditional love, ignoring the red flags because we want to believe the best about our children. But respect is a two-way street, and loyalty cannot be bought with trust funds or paid-off weddings. When you discover a viper in your house, you do not try to negotiate with it. You remove it. Protecting your peace, your spouse, and your dignity is the greatest legacy you can ever leave behind. Never apologize for surviving. If this story struck a nerve, hit that like button to let me know I am not alone. Please subscribe to the channel for more stories about surviving betrayal and fighting back. Tell me in the comments below what you would have done with that super glue. Stay strong, everyone.